March 8, 1944, 14:20 hours. 22,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley, Germany. The afternoon sky over the Ruhr stretched pale and crystalline, a dome of ice blue interrupted only by the white contrails, scratching across it like chalk on slate. At the controls of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler banked hard left, his gloved hands firm on the stick as he scanned the airspace with the practiced efficiency of a pilot who had survived 2 years of combat. The oxygen mask pressed cold against his face. His breath came in measured draws, deliberate and controlled, the way altitude demanded. Through the armored glass canopy, he could see the formations, 50, perhaps 60 American heavy bombers crawling eastward in their combat boxes, each flying fortress bristling with machine guns, their aluminum skins catching the March light. They were heading home after striking industrial targets deeper in the Reich, and Stigler's squadron had been scrambled to intercept during their withdrawal. This was the daily calculus of the air war: climb, engage, kill, survive. Repeat tomorrow. But today, the bombers were not alone. Stigler knew this before his eyes confirmed it. The radio crackled with warnings from other pilots, voices tight with urgency. Jabo, fighter bombers. Then the specific dread that had become common in recent months, Thunderbolts. The American P-47s, even the word carried weight. Stigler's hands tightened fractionally on the controls. Through the glare of sun and distance, he saw them, thick-bodied silhouettes descending from altitude. 4 of them in a loose finger-4 formation, their massive radial engines pushing them forward with a momentum that seemed less like flight and more like controlled falling. They were not nimble. They did not dart or dance like the lighter fighters. They came like sledgehammers, like something inevitable. Stigler had engaged P-47s before. Twice he had survived encounters that should have killed him. Once over Belgium, he had put 30 rounds into a Thunderbolt's fuselage from less than 200 meters and watched the American aircraft shudder, smoke briefly, and then continue flying, continuing to fight, as if the damage were an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. The pilot had pulled up, rolled inverted, and come back around for another pass, still firing. Stigler had broken off, his ammunition depleted, his fuel low, and his certainty shaken. He had shot fighters down before, Hurricanes, Spitfires, even Soviet Yaks on the Eastern Front, but the Thunderbolt absorbed punishment that should have torn any aircraft apart. It flew through conditions that should have crippled it, and those 8 machine guns, 50 caliber Brownings, 4 in each wing, did not merely wound. They obliterated. When their fire converged, metal turned to vapor and pilots ceased to exist. Now, descending from the sun, the P-47s closed the distance. Stigler felt the contraction in his chest, the autonomic response that 2 years of air combat had burned into his nervous system. He called out positions over the radio, his voice calm because discipline demanded it. But his mind ran the mathematics: altitude disadvantage, energy disadvantage, firepower disadvantage, and the grim knowledge that the Thunderbolt pilots had been taught to hunt in packs. They did not duel. They swarmed. Stigler pushed the throttle to combat emergency power, the Daimler-Benz engine roaring, and began his climb. Not to engage, but to escape. That was the new reality over Germany in 1944. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe's skies for years, was learning to run from an enemy whose aircraft seemed built not by engineers, but by some industrial deity that valued mass, power, and endurance over elegance. The P-47 was heavy, loud, brutish. It was everything German aviation doctrine had disdained, and it was winning. The sound that defined this new terror was the deep, throaty growl of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower channeled through a 4-bladed propeller, 18 cylinders hammering in synchronous rhythm. It did not whine like the inline engines of German fighters. It rumbled. It announced itself from kilometers away, a mechanical thunder that carried across the sky like a predator's roar. German pilots learned to listen for it, learned to fear it, because once you heard that sound at close range, evasion was already uncertain. The P-47 was not just a fighter. It was a symbol, a flying embodiment of American industrial might, of resources applied without restraint, of a philosophy that said, build it heavy, arm it heavily, and let mass and power compensate for finesse. To German pilots raised on the virtues of lightweight maneuverability and fuel economy, the Thunderbolt was an affront. But it was an affront that killed them with relentless efficiency. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt emerged from American design philosophy in the early 1940s, a period when the United States was still refining its understanding of modern air warfare. The aircraft's development began in 1940, shortly after the fall of France, when it became clear that American fighters would need long-range, heavy armament, and ruggedness to compete against the latest German and Japanese designs. Republic Aviation, led by designer Alexander Kartveli, created an aircraft around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower. This engine required a large airframe to accommodate its bulk, the necessary cooling systems, and the structural strength to handle the power. The result was an aircraft that weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, double the weight of many contemporary fighters. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and external stores, the P-47 could exceed 17,000 pounds. It was a massive machine, but mass brought advantages. The large airframe allowed for heavy armament, 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, with 425 rounds per gun. When fired in unison, these guns delivered a combined rate of fire exceeding 100 rounds per second, with each projectile weighing nearly 2 ounces and traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The convergence of 8 such weapons at ranges between 200 and 300 meters created a cone of destruction that could disintegrate enemy aircraft, sever control surfaces, and kill pilots through sheer kinetic impact. The P-47's firepower exceeded that of any other Allied fighter and rivaled that of some light bombers. German pilots who survived encounters with Thunderbolts consistently reported the devastating effect of that concentrated fire. Not the tracers, which were visible, but the unseen rounds, the majority of the burst, which arrived without warning and tore through aluminum and steel as if neither offered resistance. The aircraft's size also provided structural strength. The P-47's fuselage and wings were built with redundancy and robustness. Primary structural members were thick, load-bearing spars designed to handle stresses far exceeding normal flight operations. Control cables were duplicated. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, filled with fire-retardant foam. The engine's radial configuration distributed vital components in a circular pattern rather than concentrating them in line, meaning battle damage that destroyed 1 or 2 cylinders left 14 or 16 still functioning. The oil cooling system, electrical systems, and hydraulic lines were protected by armor and separation. The pilot sat in a cockpit surrounded by armor plating, head armor, back armor, armored glass windscreen. The design philosophy was simple, except that the aircraft would be hit and ensure it could continue flying and fighting after being hit. This was not elegance. It was brutal pragmatism. By March 1944, over 5,000 P-47s had been delivered to combat units in Europe and the Pacific. They equipped the U.S. Army Air Force's fighter groups assigned to escort heavy bombers deep into Germany and to conduct ground attack missions against German transportation, communication, and military targets. The 8th Air Force alone operated over 1,000 Thunderbolts, and they flew daily, weather permitting, grinding down German fighter strength through attrition. The P-47 was not universally loved by its pilots. It was heavy, required a long takeoff run, climbed more slowly than lighter fighters, and lacked the instantaneous response in roll and turn that pilots preferred. But it brought them home. That attribute, above all others, earned the Thunderbolt loyalty. Pilots who survived being shot dozens or hundreds of times, who limped home with engines damaged and controls shredded, who owed their lives to the aircraft's ability to absorb punishment, developed an almost religious reverence for the machine. The P-47 could take hits that would destroy other fighters. And in 1944, over Germany, taking hits was not a possibility, it was a certainty. German pilots entered the war with different expectations, shaped by different doctrines and different aircraft. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm was built around the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a lightweight, high-performance fighter optimized for climb rate, maneuverability, and speed. The 109 was elegant, efficient, and deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot. It embodied the German preference for quality over quantity, for achieving air superiority through superior pilot training and aircraft performance rather than through numerical advantage. In the early years of the war, Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, this philosophy had proven effective. German pilots, many of whom had combat experience from the Spanish Civil War, dominated less experienced opponents. The 109's combination of speed, climb rate, and firepower made it the benchmark against which all other fighters were measured. But the air war changed. By 1944, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy whose industrial capacity dwarfed Germany's. The United States produced over 40,000 fighters in 1944 alone, compared to Germany's 25,000. American pilot training pipelines graduated thousands of aviators per year, while German training programs, disrupted by fuel shortages and Allied bombing, struggled to replace losses. And American fighters, particularly the P-47 and the P-51 Mustang, had evolved to match or exceed the 109's performance while adding capabilities German designs lacked: range, armament weight, and survivability. The Bf 109 G6, the most common variant in 1944, still possessed excellent performance, but it was a fragile aircraft. Its inline Daimler-Benz engine was vulnerable. A single hit to the coolant system would cause overheating and failure within minutes. Its lightweight construction meant that battle damage often resulted in structural failure. Its ammunition load was limited. 2 13mm machine guns and a single 20mm or 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, with enough ammunition for perhaps 15 seconds of sustained fire. German pilots were trained to make every burst count, to close to within 200 meters, fire a precise burst, and break away. Ammunition conservation was doctrine. The P-47 represented the opposite philosophy: volume of fire. American pilots were trained to open fire at 400 meters and hold the trigger until the target was destroyed or they were out of ammunition. With 3,400 rounds total, a Thunderbolt pilot could fire continuous bursts for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in air combat. The psychological impact on German pilots was significant. They heard the sustained roar of 8 machine guns, saw the traces streaming past, felt the hammering impacts as 50 caliber rounds struck their aircraft, and understood that the enemy was expending ammunition at a rate German logistics could never sustain. One German pilot, interrogated after being shot down in April 1944, described the experience. The American fired and fired and fired. I thought he must be out of ammunition, but he continued. My aircraft was hit many times. I counted 17 holes afterward. One round severed my rudder cable, another punctured my fuel tank. I broke off and dove, and still he followed, still firing. I have never experienced such firepower. It is not marksmanship. It's a wall of bullets, and if you are in that wall, you die. The documented resilience of the P-47 became legendary and was supported by extensive records. Combat loss reports, pilot testimonies, and post-mission aircraft inspections revealed the extent of damage Thunderbolts sustained and survived. Aircraft returned to base with hundreds of bullet and shrapnel holes, with cylinders shot out of engines, with control surfaces partially destroyed, with hydraulic systems failed, and yet they flew. One particularly well-documented case involved a P-47D flown by Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group. On June 26, 1943, over France, Johnson's aircraft was attacked by a Focke-Wulf FW-190. The German pilot made repeated passes, raking the Thunderbolt with 20mm cannon fire. Johnson was wounded, his canopy was shattered, his instruments destroyed, and his aircraft absorbed over 200 hits. The controls were barely responsive. Fuel streamed from ruptured tanks, yet the P-47 continued to fly. Johnson, unable to bail out due to the jammed canopy, nursed the crippled aircraft across the English Channel and landed at his home base. The aircraft was repaired and returned to service. Johnson survived to become one of the war's leading aces, crediting the Thunderbolt's toughness with saving his life. Such incidents were not anomalies. They were common. 8th Air Force maintenance records from 1944 show that over 40% of P-47s returning from combat missions bore battle damage, yet fewer than 3% were written off as total losses. The aircraft could absorb damage that would destroy fighters with less robust construction. The radial engine in particular proved extraordinarily resilient. Unlike inline engines, which ceased functioning if the coolant system was breached, the radial could lose multiple cylinders and continue running. P-47s returned to base with as many as 6 cylinders destroyed by enemy fire, the engine hammering unevenly but still producing enough power to sustain flight. The redundancy of systems, the strength of the airframe, and the survivability features designed into the aircraft combined to create a machine that simply refused to die easily. German intelligence officers, analyzing captured P-47s and interrogating pilots, produced reports that reflect growing concern about the aircraft's capabilities. One Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from May 1944, preserved in post-war archives, states, "The enemy's P-47 fighter possesses structural strength far exceeding that of our fighters. Battle damage that would cause catastrophic failure in the Bf-109 or FW-190 is often insufficient to down the P-47. The aircraft's radial engine is particularly resistant to damage. Pilots report striking the enemy aircraft repeatedly without visible effect. The P-47's 8 machine guns deliver firepower that overwhelms our fighters' armor and structure. Engagement with the P-47 should be avoided unless tactical advantage is decisive. The aircraft represents American material superiority translated into operational capability. The assessment was accurate but strategically useless. German fighters could not simply avoid P-47s, they had to intercept Allied bomber formations, and the Thunderbolts escorted those formations. Engagement was mandatory, and the tactical disadvantages identified in the report, structural fragility, limited ammunition, vulnerability to sustained fire, could not be remedied. German industry was already stretched to its limits, and introducing new designs or significantly modifying existing aircraft would disrupt production at a time when losses demanded maximum output of current types. The Luftwaffe was trapped in a paradigm. Its fighters were optimized for an air war of 1940, but it was fighting the air war of 1944, where American abundance in machines, pilots, and ammunition overwhelmed German qualitative advantages. The emotional transformation experienced by German pilots as the war progressed is evident in their writings. Interviews and the gradual erosion of morale documented in Luftwaffe records. In 1940, German fighter pilots were confident, even arrogant. They believed in their training, their aircraft, and their cause. The early victories, Poland crushed in weeks, France defeated in months, the RAF driven from continental skies, seemed to confirm German superiority. Pilots spoke of air combat as a test of skill and courage, a modern form of knightly combat where the superior warrior prevailed. This romanticism persisted into the invasion of the Soviet Union, where, despite facing numerical disadvantages, Luftwaffe pilots initially dominated Soviet air forces through superior tactics and experience. But by 1944, the romanticism had died. The pilots who survived, and many did not, spoke differently. They spoke of exhaustion, of flying multiple sorties per day against overwhelming numbers, of watching comrades disappear in flames, of the hopelessness of facing an enemy who could replace every loss while German losses were irreplaceable. The arrival of the P-47 in large numbers coincided with this transformation. The Thunderbolt was not an opponent that invited chivalry. It was blunt, brutal, and impersonal. Its pilots did not seek individual duels. They worked in teams, using altitude, speed, and coordinated attacks to isolate and destroy German fighters. The 8-gun salvos did not wound, they obliterated. There was no glory in being hit by a Thunderbolt. There was only a brief moment of terror, the hammering impacts, and then fire and falling. One German pilot's diary, recovered after the war and published in a German aviation history journal, contains an entry from March 1944 that captures this transformation. Today, we lost Hartmann and Becker. Both were good pilots, experienced, careful. Both were killed by P-47s over Schweinfurt. I watched Hartmann's 109 come apart under fire. The wings separated and the fuselage tumbled. There was no parachute. Becker's aircraft burned. He may have bailed out, but if he did, I did not see it. These Americans do not fight like pilots. They fight like gunners, like men operating machines designed only to destroy. We were told our aircraft were superior, our training was superior, that we would prevail through skill. But skill matters less when the enemy has 8 guns to our 3, when he can fire 5 times longer, when his aircraft survives hits that would kill ours. I do not know if we can win this war in the air. I know only that every mission now feels like survival is luck, not skill. The diarist's words reflect the ideological collapse occurring within the Luftwaffe. The narrative of German superiority, technological, tactical, personal, was being disproven daily. Pilots were not failing because they lacked courage or ability. They were failing because they were outnumbered, outgunned, and flying aircraft that, while excellent in design, were not built for the kind of attrition warfare the Americans waged. The P-47 was a weapon of attrition. It was built to be lost and replaced, to absorb damage and continue fighting, to sustain operations that would ground more delicate machines. German pilots, accustomed to aircraft that demanded care and precise handling, faced an opponent that reflected a fundamentally different philosophy. Overwhelming force applied relentlessly. The symbolic weight of the 8 machine guns became central to how both sides understood the air war. For American pilots, the 850s represented firepower, the ability to reach out and destroy the enemy with certainty. Training emphasized gunnery, and pilots spent hours on ground ranges and in aerial practice learning to lead targets, to fire in short, controlled bursts, and to maximize the probability of hits. But the abundance of ammunition also allowed for a more forgiving approach. If you missed, you had enough rounds to try again. The 8-gun armament was not subtle. It was designed to saturate a volume of airspace with projectiles to ensure that at least some rounds found the target. The result was a weapon system that was effective even in the hands of adequately trained pilots, and devastating in the hands of experts. For German pilots, the sound of those 8 guns firing simultaneously, a sound some survivors described as a ripping or tearing noise, distinct from the sharper crack of cannon fire, became associated with death. The P-47's guns were mounted far out in the wings, and when they converged at the set range, typically 250-300 meters, the cone of fire was roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything within that cone was subjected to impacts from projectiles carrying enormous kinetic energy. Each 50 caliber round could penetrate armor plate up to an inch thick at close range. They could sever structural members, destroy engines, puncture fuel tanks, and kill pilots through the combined force of multiple impacts. German pilots learned that if they heard that distinctive sound, If they saw the muzzle flashes from a P-47's wings, evasion had to be immediate and violent. Hesitation meant death. The 8 guns also allowed the P-47 to engage ground targets with devastating effect. By mid-1944, Thunderbolts were increasingly used in the ground attack role, strafing German trains, trucks, tanks, and troop concentrations. The 850s could destroy locomotives, penetrate the thin top armor of armored vehicles, and suppress anti-aircraft positions. German ground forces learned to fear the sound of the R-2800 engine as much as German pilots did. The Thunderbolt's ability to transition from air superiority fighter to ground attack aircraft, carrying bombs and rockets in addition to its guns, made it a persistent threat across all altitudes. There was no safe altitude. High altitude, the P-47s escorted bombers. Low altitude, they hunted ground targets. The aircraft's versatility, combined with its toughness and firepower, made it omnipresent. When Luftwaffe ground crew chief, responsible for maintaining fighters at an airfield in France, was interviewed after the war as part of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, he described the impact of P-47 operations. We could not work during the day. The Thunderbolts came every day, sometimes twice. They destroyed our aircraft on the ground. They destroyed our fuel trucks. They killed our mechanics. We moved operations to night only, but even then, we feared they would strafe us during dusk or dawn. The sound of their engines, that deep roar, meant we should run to the shelters. Several times, I saw them attack. The traces are beautiful and terrible. The noise of their guns is like heavy canvas being torn. After they left, we would find our aircraft full of holes, our equipment destroyed. We could not replace what they destroyed as fast as they destroyed it. This was the difference. They had many aircraft, many pilots, many bullets. We had few and fewer each day. The documented cases of P-47s absorbing extraordinary damage and surviving are numerous and well attested. Beyond Robert Johnson's famous case, records contain dozens of similar incidents. On July 5, 1944, a P-47 of the 78th Fighter Group was hit by flak over Germany, severing the tail section just forward of the horizontal stabilizer. The aircraft should have been uncontrollable, yet the pilot managed to nurse it back to England, flying at low speed with full forward stick pressure, and crash-landed successfully. On August 12, 1944, a Thunderbolt engaged a German fighter at low altitude and collided with it, the P-47's propeller striking the enemy aircraft's tail. The German fighter crashed. The P-47, with a bent propeller and damaged engine, flew home. On September 20, 1944, a P-47 took a direct hit from an 80mm anti-aircraft shell that detonated inside the fuselage behind the cockpit. The explosion blew a hole 4 feet in diameter through the aircraft's spine. The pilot, though wounded, kept the aircraft flying and made an emergency landing at a forward airstrip. These were not miracles. They were the result of design choices that prioritized survivability. The P-47's structural strength meant that damage that should have caused catastrophic failure instead resulted in degraded but survivable flight characteristics. The pilot's armor meant that shrapnel and bullets that should have killed the pilot instead struck armor plate. The engine's design meant that damage that should have caused immediate failure instead reduced power gradually, giving pilots time to reach friendly territory. The aircraft was built to be nearly unkillable, and while many were indeed destroyed, the percentage that survived lethal-appearing damage was extraordinary. German aircraft, by comparison, lacked these margins. The Bf-109's narrow landing gear made ground handling difficult and contributed to accidents. Its lightweight structure meant battle damage often led to structural failure. Its inline engine required constant coolant circulation. Any leak meant overheating and seizure within minutes. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, while more robust than the 109, still lacked the redundancy and damage tolerance of the P-47. German pilots, ejecting from damaged aircraft, often expressed surprise. Upon being captured and shown American fighters at the level of protection and structural strength built into Allied designs. One captured pilot, shown a P-47's cockpit armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, reportedly said, "If we had this, perhaps we would not lose so many pilots. But we do not have the resources for such things. We must build lighter to save materials. Your abundance allows you to build heavy. That abundance is why you are winning." The transformation in Luftwaffe doctrine and tactics reflected the reality of facing the P-47 and other advanced Allied fighters. By late 1944, German fighter tactics had shifted from offensive to defensive, from seeking combat to avoiding it except under favorable conditions. Luftwaffe pilots were instructed to attack bomber formations, but to avoid prolonged engagements with escorts. If P-47s or P-51s intervened, German fighters were to break off and withdraw. This represented a complete inversion of the early war doctrine, when German fighters had been the aggressors, seeking out and destroying enemy aircraft. The psychological impact of this shift was corrosive. Fighter pilots are trained to be aggressive, to seize initiative, to dominate the enemy. Being told to run, to avoid combat, to accept that the enemy owns the sky. This undermined the identity and morale of the fighter arm. The reasons for the shift were pragmatic. Germany could not replace pilot losses at the rate they were occurring. Experienced pilots, those with hundreds of flight hours and multiple kills, were irreplaceable assets. Losing them in disadvantageous engagements was strategically wasteful. Better to preserve the force, to strike when conditions favored success, and to accept that air superiority was lost. But pilots did not join the fighter arm to avoid combat, and the policy created resentment and frustration. The memoirs and interviews of surviving Luftwaffe pilots from this period reflect bitterness, not toward the enemy, but toward their own leadership for sending them into battles they could not win with resources they did not have. One Luftwaffe squadron commander, writing in his post-war memoir, reflected on this period. By autumn 1944, we had lost air superiority permanently. The Americans owned the sky. We flew when they permitted it, and we died when they chose to kill us. The P-47 was the symbol of this dominance. It was not the best fighter they had. The P-51 was faster, the P-38 more versatile, but it was the most intimidating. It came in groups of 8, 12, 16 aircraft, and they did not maneuver beautifully like our pilots had once done. They simply dove from altitude, fired those 8 guns, and climbed away. If we tried to follow, they had altitude advantage. If we dove away, they followed. If we tried to engage, we were outnumbered. The only victories we achieved were when they made mistakes, and they made fewer mistakes as the war went on. We made the same mistakes repeatedly because we had no choice. We had to engage, had to defend, had to fly missions that were tactically unsound because strategically we had no alternative. The epilogue of the P-47's combat record is written in statistics and in the silence of pilots who did not return. From 1943 to 1945, Thunderbolts flew over 550,000 combat sorties in Europe alone, more than any other American fighter type. They destroyed over 11,000 enemy aircraft, split between aerial combat and ground strafing. They dropped over 132,000 tons of bombs and fired over 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Over 3,000 P-47s were lost to all causes, enemy action, accidents, mechanical failure. But given the intensity and duration of operations, the loss rate was remarkably low. The aircraft's survivability translated into pilot survivability. P-47 pilots had higher survival rates than those flying other fighter types, not because they were better trained or more cautious, but because the aircraft brought them home when they should have died. For German pilots, the P-47 became a symbol of American material dominance and the futility of resisting it. The aircraft represented everything Nazi ideology had dismissed. Crude, heavy, built through mass production rather than craftsmanship, relying on quantity and brute force rather than elegance and skill. Yet it worked. It dominated, it killed German pilots and destroyed German aircraft in numbers that eroded the Luftwaffe to ineffectiveness. By May 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the Luftwaffe was shattered, not because German pilots lacked courage or because German aircraft were poorly designed, but because Germany could not sustain the attrition warfare that American industry made inevitable. The P-47, with its 8 machine guns and its ability to absorb thousands of hits, was both the instrument and the symbol of that attrition. To stand today in the aviation museums that preserve these aircraft is to confront the physical weight of history. The P-47s on display, restored and polished, are massive machines. Their fuselages are thick, their wings broad, their propellers enormous. Walking beneath one, you sense the solidity, the density, the sheer mass that made them survivable. The cockpit, when you peer inside, is cramped despite the aircraft's size. The armor plates crowd the pilot. The instrument panel is dense with gauges. The visibility is limited by the large radial engine ahead. It was not a comfortable aircraft to fly, but it was an aircraft that kept men alive. And the pilots who flew them understood that comfort was irrelevant when the alternative was death. The German fighters displayed nearby, the sleek Bf-19s and M2 Brownings, are beautiful in a way the Thunderbolt is not. They are elegant, purposeful, refined, but they are also fragile, light, built to minimize weight and maximize performance. The contrast is instructive. The Germans built aircraft for the war they expected to fight, a war of skill, maneuverability, and decisive engagements. The Americans built aircraft for the war they knew they would have to fight, a war of attrition, endurance, and overwhelming force. History judged which philosophy was correct. The sound of the R-2800 engine is still remembered by those who heard it. Veterans, both American and German, describe it in their memoirs. The deep, resonant thunder that announced the P-47's presence. The mechanical growl that grew louder as the aircraft approached. The sound that meant for Americans that protection had arrived. And for Germans, that death was near. That sound is preserved in recordings, in documentary footage, in the memory of air shows where restored Thunderbolts fly. It is a sound of power channeled, of industrial might translated into kinetic energy, of a democracy's productive capacity manifested in aluminum, steel, and fire. The 8 machine guns, silent now in museum aircraft, are cleaned and displayed with their ammunition feeds and charging mechanisms visible. Each gun weighs 64 pounds. Together, the 8 guns and their ammunition added over 1,000 pounds to the aircraft's weight. That weight represented a choice, to prioritize firepower over agility, to accept reduced maneuverability in exchange for overwhelming lethality. It was the choice of an industrial power that could afford to build heavy because resources were abundant, that could afford to add weight because engines were powerful enough to carry it, and that could afford to expend ammunition freely because factories produced it faster than it could be fired. The Germans made different choices because they faced different constraints, and those choices, rational within their context, were insufficient against an enemy unburdened by scarcity. The larger truth embedded in the P-47 story is about the nature of total war in the industrial age. Wars are won, not by individual heroes or superior tactics alone, but by societies capable of mobilizing resources, sustaining production, and overwhelming opponents through systematic application of material advantage. The P-47 was not a beautiful aircraft. It was not elegant or innovative. It was a blunt instrument, designed to a purpose, built in quantity, and employed with the simple logic that more firepower, more armor, and more aircraft would eventually prevail. That logic proved correct. For German pilots who survived the war, the memory of the P-47 remained vivid. In interviews conducted decades later, when asked about their most feared opponent, many cited the Thunderbolt, not because it was the fastest or most maneuverable, but because it was relentless, unkillable, and everywhere. It represented the moment when they understood that the war was lost, that no amount of skill or courage could overcome the material disparity between the two sides. The 8 machine guns, the radial engine, the ability to absorb damage that should have been fatal, these attributes combined to create an opponent that could not be defeated by the means available to them. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the aircraft that won the air war alone. The P-51 Mustang, with its longer range, ultimately provided the strategic escort capability that allowed bombers to reach deep into Germany and return. The P-38 Lightning filled specialized roles. British Spitfires and Hurricanes defended home airspace. Soviet fighters bled the Luftwaffe in the east, but the P-47 was the weapon that embodied American abundance and the willingness to expend resources in pursuit of victory. It was heavy because America could afford heavy. It was armed extravagantly because America produced ammunition in excess. It was built tough because American doctrine valued pilot survival. And it killed German pilots not through elegance, but through the blunt application of industrial power. In the end, the thunder was not just the sound of the engine. It was the sound of inevitability, the sound of a nation's factories, its resources, and its will manifested in an aircraft that could not be stopped, could not be killed easily, and would not stop coming. For the German pilots who heard that thunder from 22,000 feet, who saw the dark shapes diving from the sun, who felt the hammering of 8 machine guns tearing through their aircraft, it was the sound of the future. A future where they were no longer the predators, but the prey. Where skill no longer mattered as much as mass, and where the certainty they had known, the certainty of German superiority, was revealed as the lie it had always been. The weight of thunder was measured not in pounds of metal or rounds of ammunition, but in the accumulated realization, across thousands of engagements and hundreds of lost lives, that the war was lost because the enemy possessed not just better weapons, but an inexhaustible capacity to produce, deploy, and replace those weapons. The P-47, with its 8 guns and its armored hide, was the messenger that delivered this truth. And for those who heard the message and survived to remember it, the sound of that 18-cylinder engine would echo in memory for the rest of their lives, a reminder of the day when steel and thunder rewrote the sky, and the old certainties burned and fell away like so much shattered metal, tumbling through empty air toward the ground below.